Hello everyone, welcome to Over Analytical with Taven Jorgensen. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'm hoping I will make this time valuable and useful for you. The goal of this podcast is to spread my philosophy of interest and curiosity around these complex and abstract ideas. I'm hoping to stimulate and grow the conversation on these matters. I think it has a lot of benefit, and I think you'll see that if you stick around and listen. Alright. Thank you guys for making it through the weird, odd, edited version of my voice. I couldn't stand hearing it again. But, as you all know, the first episode of my podcast, Over Analytical, is out right now since you're here. So, thanks, everyone. That's awesome. So, I sort of alluded to what the goals of this podcast were in the intro, but I can give you a little more in-depth now with a little more time. So I've been writing a lot of journals lately, and I've been talking to a lot of people, having a lot of stimulating conversations, and I've actually gotten a lot of feedback from people saying that I should push into something like this and sort of help further the conversation, and that's sort of what I'm trying to do. The first topic today that I'm going to talk about is how real is free will. And sort of the free will I'm alluding to is mostly based off of like the Christian religion and sort of the interpretations they make, where you get to decide your destiny with the decisions you make and how you proceed going forward. I think there's a lot of value in that idea, and I think it's beneficial for the most part, but how, physiologically accurate really is it? And I'm going to kind of delve into that and how I sort of think there's more of constraint than we all like to really acknowledge a lot. And I think putting it forward and really acknowledging this constraint is beneficial for all of us. And I'll sort of break down through my thought process of it all. So stick with me here. Okay, I sort of talked about what I define as what is free will. And it's sort of this idea of you get a set in a choice. You have two different decisions. There's a fork in the road, more metaphorically, is a way to look at it. And you get to decide which direction you get to go. And when typically objectively looked at as a good decision, you go forward in life, and a bad decision, you might come back in life. It's never actually that much of a razor's edge as we all can imagine in real life. There's a lot more gray areas in a lot of the decisions we do, but I do believe that it can come down to an objective basis if you could really get into the analytical mindset to wrap your head around all of the different kind of subconscious pulls in psychology and nature versus nurture that's attributing to the decision making going on. So the first kind of, argument, I'll call it, for why I don't believe you have free will is I think criminals are a pretty good example that highlight this pretty extremely. I think this system of, I believe it's 2 million plus criminals, or 2 million plus federally incarcerated in the United States, which the money of that is ridiculous, and the reform effectiveness is clearly not there. But this idea is a lot of those people made conscious decisions for getting there, and that's why they are there. But I think that it's weird because if you ask any 6-year-old child in this country or any of your little cousins or anybody you know, very few people are going to wish that they ended up in a circumstance like in prison. Like, most would actually say it's probably the most horrific way they could end up. Yet we have such a pattern of so many people going there. And I guess drug addicts are sort of the highlight of this specifically, is we all know how dangerous these severe drugs are, and we've all been taught it since a long time. Like, I know obviously education has been increased over my lifetime and the lifetime slightly before mine, but for the most part, there's clear evidence that we all know what's going on, yet we still see these cases of addiction that is uncontrollable and bringing down lives and families. So I sort of will present the idea to you is, what do you think makes you different than that person? Like, do you think you and that person don't both see the reality in the circumstance and you both don't behave the same way? Like, I think all we're really doing is trying to behave for our best selves. We think we're doing what's best in the real time to benefit ourselves long term. How conscious that thought is and how deep we really get into it is a degree for every individual person. And obviously somebody who's a drug addict is on the lesser end of that spectrum, you would presume. But I still think it's crazy to think that somebody would consciously still choose to make that decision with knowing what the ramifications of it are. Like, how could somebody consciously give themselves addiction? And that's sort of why I put it in a boat where it's a mental illness to the degree. Whether they gave the mental illness to themselves or not is kind of besides the point in my perspective. I think schizophrenia is schizophrenia, regardless of if you were born with it or whether you got it through a pattern that you developed that you couldn't break out of. I'd almost argue they're both a natural cause of schizophrenia. The other more extreme example of criminals that I guess I kind of want to get into is like pedophiles. I think that there's a lot more complicated of a circumstance going on there, especially with the immediate pullback we all have. Like even me bringing up that word, it probably sent a lot of triggers through a lot of people listening to this. Is like, oh my gosh, is Taven really about to defend pedophiles? And no, obviously I'm not going to defend the horrific behavior that it is, but my point is, because we all have this such strong emotional sense of like how wrong and messed up that is, how can these people still consciously behave that way? Like understanding the ramifications of their actions. And I guess I'm sort of proposing is they must have a justification system or some flaw in their logic, or maybe a flaw in their hardwiring functioning in their DNA. Like I think it would be crazy to think that anybody would ever want to grow up to be the monsters that they grow up to be, yet somehow so many have become that. And that's sort of why I think we need to take a bigger step back and look at what this issue of free will is and what it really means. And so then I'll kind of take you down the next school of thought that I think is interesting with free will is the decision making you make now is highly predicated on everything you've known up until this point and every thought process you've ever had to now. You only know what you think you know is best for you. And I think we can all agree to that. And we also talk about this in terms of privilege and a lot of accessibility to information and knowledge that people with more privilege tend to have than others. And there's different roads, and we can acknowledge this difference there, but yet we somehow remove it when we evaluate decision making of others. So I sort of root back your decisions as every decision I make is just the best decision I know how to make. And that decision was based on the best decision I just made a second ago and a second ago before that. And I think you can chase that back all the way to when I was a kid, or when I was before consciously making decisions. I was probably, I would guess, 3, 4, 5 years old. All of the stimuli, so all of my DNA was picked for me. I didn't pick my parents. I didn't pick where I was born. I didn't pick anything about that. So already I'd argue half of your free will is constrained by just who you are and what your genetic code makes up. The other half of your constraint is your nurture, correct? But I'd also argue that's heavily impacted by that DNA and by that location you grew up. My mom showed me every stimuli that I ever interacted with until the time I was about 3 or 4 years old. And that stimuli formed the basic structures of my mind and my thought process. That thought process then governed and dictated every decision I made going forward, up until every decision to now. So was I really the one in control of my path if I was the one who was set on the path by someone else? And I guess the way I view it is, I don't think I do have complete control. I have as much control as I think I can, and I can decide between eating a cookie and an apple. But I think at the end of the day, the long-term direction and trajectory of my life might not be as much in my hands as I like to admit. I like to think that it is. And then I guess this is other story that sort of relates to this, that is by a philosopher and neuroscientist that I follow. His name's Sam Harris, and he sort of talks about this guy, and it's the story of this guy. He was a loving man. I'll try to include a citation below in the video so you can hear him talk about it yourself, but I'll sum up for most of you. And the story is, this guy, he had a happy family, he lived a normal life, and then he started acting and feeling weird one day, and his wife noticed some weird tendencies in his kids, but he didn't really say much about it. Well, the guy went on to, I believe, kill his wife with a shotgun, climb up on the water tower, and shoot at police officers until he was ultimately shot dead on the tower, where they then ran an autopsy on his body, and they found that he had actually developed a tumor on the part of your brain that is responsible for decision making. I can't exactly place the exact word, so I won't even try, but there's a part of your brain that's specifically allocated to your decision making process, and this tumor was squeezing down on that area of the brain, and that clearly affected his decision making and made him go more crazy and lunatic like. And they found actually that he was keeping a diary or a journal of notes, and you could clearly see there was a connection to what was going on in his brain to when the tumor started to develop that influenced his decision making. That man is a victim of biology. I don't know what free will he had in that circumstance or what choice he really had in that, but I think it's sort of dangerous to be mad at him or to even associate anger towards him when you know the cause of his bad doings had nothing to do with him, and he was solely a victim of his circumstance. It's sort of an interesting school of thought to follow, and obviously we can't just abolish and forget about crimes that people commit and wrongdoings that they do, But the more conscious human being, I believe, realizes that most of this negative energy coming at them isn't necessarily from the person it's coming from. It's from something a lot rooted deeper. So, and then I guess this sort of presents a major problem with the ethical, like, way we conduct our law and our crime system. Is it's based on this idea that you have free will and you have the consent to make and choose what you want to choose and do what you want to do. But if what I just proposed is really accurate and we really don't have as much choice as we'd want to admit, should there be different standards for holding people accountable in different circumstances? Should we really extend the degree of ignorance that should be justifiable as a defense as it really might be? I don't know. It's a really touchy subject, but I guess the only metaphor I can compare it to is, like, I would think of it like parenting, and this sort of the goal of the reconstructive criminal justice system is to reform these people and to make them citizens again that can have productive benefits and not have the same ideology that put them in the circumstance they were. So if that was true, it's sort of like how you want to correct a child's behavior. You want to be a child's friend as a parent, you want to have as much fun and grow and develop, but there's a certain time where you have to be the law, or you have to change a bad behavior early on before it spurs and grows into something that really can negatively impact the child's development. And I guess if you maybe metaphorically treated prisoners like children, our solution is to punish them without any reformative benefit repeatedly. It's not really in the benefit of all of our interests, or even their interests, to be doing something like that. And the big way it has on the federal prison system, you can see, or the federal budget, I mean, that the federal prison system has, it doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be a fair, true, equal justice system if we're not taking into account that people aren't in the best circumstances to make the best decisions for themselves. And frankly, I don't even necessarily think it would be fair for the ideologic Christian God to have the same sort of assumption. So it's like, if these variables I bring up really are as significant as they are, how is it fair for God to judge that creation of the man who spiraled out into rage and craziness after a brain tumor affected the part of his brain that was responsible for decision making? Like, I don't know if you think you are different, but the chances of you behaving in the exact same circumstance, with the exact same genes and the exact same tumor, with the exact same life experience, is probably the same. I think we all belong to this more... It's almost as if we are animalistic in a way, yet our spectrum of behavior is a lot wider. You know what a bear does. A bear mauls when it's hungry and wants food or for defense, or it runs. It has a very limited spectrum of psychological behavior, so it's easy to cast it in that more animalistic attitude where we can't be mad at a bear for killing someone because that's just what bears do. A bear is behaving like a bear does. I would argue that a human is behaving like a human does when it commits acts of maldoing. And I think that most humans, obviously there's a few that are psychopathic that would fall on the spectrum of consciously wanting to do bad for their own benefit, but I think most humans don't behave badly if they're conscious of what they're doing. If they really truly internalize and are conscious of the effect and the ramifications of all their actions have, I don't think there's true evil in the world. I don't think anybody would actually behave in these ways. I think they just don't have the adequate pieces and tools to make the proper decisions for themselves, and that leads them into these problems. But I think that, sort of for our own benefit, this sort of natural artificial barrier we draw between humanity and animals might need to sort of be closed down. Because I think if we were treating these vicious people who are animalistic, like in the human population that create problems, more like the psychological approach to dealing with animals, we might have a more effective plan for treating it and fixing it in the future going forward. It's sort of an odd justification, because you'd like to think that humanity is different and we have something that is like a physical difference between us and animals that would make us conscious or different, or we know that we have a strain of higher intelligence, but sometimes that even gets disputed depending on who you talk to, with the different species with comparable intelligence, the different primates with borderline comparable intelligence, and then the different species of mushrooms and other plant life that has arguably different strains of intelligence. It's sort of like the Einstein quote of, if you judged a fish on how well it climbs a tree, you're obviously not going to evaluate its true potential very well. It's sort of the same in terms of how we look at intelligence. We value our intelligence as the highest, but we don't necessarily objectively prove it. And that sort of brings me to the point, is another Sam Harris point, where there's a clip where he talks about how your brain neurology, and there's a bunch of experience and science they've done in it. It might have actually come from one of his books, but they bring up how you can't necessarily point to a specific region in the human brain that contains its consciousness. And they've done experiments in the past where they've pulled out different sections of the human brain individually to test and wake up the subject to see which part of the brain would remove his consciousness, and they found nowhere within pulling any different parts of the brain out that the consciousness was not contained in any region ever. The same is true with animals. So are animals conscious? Because we don't have anything objectively, atomically, that would point to why our level of consciousness is any different than their level of consciousness. It's sort of an interesting outlook, because you'd like to think that we're more conscious and our spectrum of behavior is more complex, but does that necessarily truly believe we are more conscious? Is the dog and the bear having an internal thought process similar to mine? Does it talk to itself? Does it still do the same things? I'm not sure, but I think it sort of really bears a question of whether there really is an intrinsic difference in the level of consciousness between humans and animals. I think the gray area that exists here is a lot more existent and prevalent than a lot of people necessarily have ever even comprehended, I guess. So, and I guess if you can really extend this argument out even farther to an even more scary degree, is, are inanimate objects really conscious? Because if there's really no level of consciousness I can point to in your brain, then who's to say that an inanimate object could not necessarily be conscious? Like, is a water bottle, you necessarily don't know. Like, it still could have a consciousness if there's nothing objectively, atomically that points to it in us. How could you say it's not with them? And I guess the only sort of evidence we have for this is sort of like, in the very, very limited grasp of scale I know about, like, subatomic particles and things like that. I know about this. It's kind of this cool idea about the double split experiment, which we've included the video below in the video. But basically, the gist of the experiment is they talk about marbles, or shooting marbles through. It's like a double slit, and they shoot these marbles through, and they find that when they shoot the marbles through at a rapid rate, a pattern forms of a certain degree. And then when you use waves through the double split, a different sort of pattern approaches. So then when you take this down to the subatomic level and you shoot electrons rather than marbles, this weird thing happens where if you shoot them at the same time, you get a different result than if you shoot them one at a time. And then an even weirder thing happens when you observe, because they found that the pattern on the wall when they shot them all at once resembled waves for some weird reason, and they couldn't understand why that happened because they thought it would behave like the marble. Well, so they started shooting it one at a time, and then they found that the pattern formed of the two of the original. So something about shooting it one at a time changed the wave pattern. So then they put a camera ultimately in there to test whether, to see which one of the two slits this electron would go through. And they found that once the camera was actually observing the experiment, it altered the results. And then mathematically they couldn't prove whether the electron went through one slit or both slits. I'm sort of brutalizing my explanation of this video, but the abstract of what it's trying to get to is the nature of subatomic particles is that when they're observed, they behave differently. It's sort of kind of like the Toy Story theory to a degree, is you have this idea that when kids leave a room, the toys get up and live lives and are animate and conscious and existent, and then when the kids come back, they play a game and lay back on the ground. Well, we have a little bit of proof through this double split experiment that that sort of thing might be going on at a subatomic level. So, I guess what I'm saying is, if a tree falls in the woods, does it even actually fall at all?
You just listened to the Over-Analytical podcast, where all opinions are subject to change when presented with better or more adequate information. Taven does not seek to be right, but to find the objective truths to further develop the conversation.